We have with us today Jane Halton, and there's bios in the book. Jane, I might ask you to come up front if I could. Jane's bio is in the book, but of course, well-known public servant with a long track record there, and now a key player in the corporate sector and on a number of boards. Tim Gartrell, who is known for his strong campaigning skills, has been involved in politics and other campaigns, including most recently the marriage equality campaign, and Jan Owen, who is many things, social entrepreneur, innovator, and currently CEO of the Foundation for Young Australians. I'm just going to start with some questions for each of the panellists. I might start with you, Jane. There are so many ways that you can enter this debate, and I'll leave it to you. I'll give you two, and you can decide which one you'd prefer to dive in on. You've got a really strong background in terms of the health sector and the role of the public sector in delivering health services. So I'm interested in understanding what you think the priorities are there and how we can meet community expectations. And then perhaps on the other side of the coin, more recently, of course, you've joined a number of corporate boards, including a major bank board, where the ANZ, where I would hope that some of the themes that have emerged from this survey are the sorts of issues that are being discussed in terms of, how business better meets the expectations of community and how a business bridges that trust gap that we've seen in a way which will hopefully over time create more support for the sort of reforms needed to support a strong business sector.
There's a whole hour in those two questions, so I won't take that amount of time. Thank you. I have to sort of think about which hat I put on, don't I, when I answer some of these questions. And one of the things I also do these days is I'm the chair of COTA, which, if I think about my really long-term connections, ageing and issues for older people are something I've always taken very seriously. I have a great personal and professional interest in. The challenge of health, I read the results when I was sent the survey, and frankly it didn't surprise me at all. One of the things we know is that people are pretty good about thinking about themselves. And I think particularly in the modern world where everything is personal, every service delivery interaction you have is judged against not just the sector that you're thinking of, but actually the best personal experience you have. So you're judging everything these days against a standard, which is possibly not the standard that you used to be judging it against. But you also think about yourself in terms of the things that would really worry you. And health is something that I think everybody, they like to assume they have it, but they kind of deep down worry that if something goes wrong with their health, that they can rely on a service delivery network and the professional skill and capacity and access to those people that will deliver them an improved outcome. So the question of how governments in particular, the public sector, but also the health professions and people who deliver health services actually can respond to those concerns, I think are very real. You put up on one of the slides the nasty P word, the productivity word. And one of the things, I don't know how many of you are a bit sad like me and occasionally you get into a Productivity Commission report. Hands up who's read a Productivity Commission report recently. Oh, there's a lot of sad people in this room. Excellent. So if you look at the most recent productivity report, there's a whole series of things in there which I think if people on the commute from Parramatta into the centre of Sydney, and I do not believe that commute times are not an issue, just by the way. But if you asked any of those people whether, in fact, the common sense things, particularly in respect of health and some of the improvements in productivity you can get in health, that should even be a debate, they would look at you horrified and say, you've got to be joking. Is nobody doing anything about that? Why are we continuing to pay for low-value care? That means care for which there is no evidence of any efficacy, to be completely clear. Why are we paying for that? Why are you telling me I can't have this very high-cost drug, which is at the cutting edge of technology, and yet I am paying still for people to stick scopes into knees when the long-since understanding is there's no benefit to it? So people would say to us as policymakers, as commentators on policy, as players in the system, are you mad? How stupid? Just do it. So the productivity stuff, which you look at in the Productivity Commission, I think is really one of the places we have to go, particularly in relation to health. I'm a big believer that there will be a technological revolution in health, though, and I think it will come from big data. If you look at the cutting edge, and there are all sorts of things we could talk about in health which are not good in the United States, but if you look at some of the really cutting edge providers of healthcare and people who help you navigate healthcare systems in the United States at the moment, what you'll see is smart, learning, AI-enabled technology that doesn't actually expect an entire system to reorganise itself around the person. It helps you manage your way through the system in a really smart way. So I think there's opportunity, but we have to actually start having a common sense conversation. And from a corporate perspective, and I won't belabour this, one of the things that we are certainly talking about at the bank is that whole, not just corporate social responsibility, it's a question of what the shared values are. Because ultimately people these days, and particularly younger people, they want to sign on to something which is of shared value to them. And our staff want that as well. So yes, we're having that conversation. Is it always easy? No. What does it mean in terms of how we deliver services? Well, to start with, simpler, et cetera, et cetera. But yes, that conversation is happening, and big bureaucracies, doesn't matter whether they're public or private, are hard to shift, but we're trying.
Now, I've just been reminded by some people up in the booth that I was meant to tell you before I finished that we thought we'd have a bit of fun and do a poll. So the team's going to put up on the screen some instructions for you if you want to have a say about the things that matter the most to you. And we're going to have a look at that as we go through with some of the Q&A. Okay, you talked about young people, which is fantastic. Can someone take a photo and tweet that? So you mentioned young people, so it gives me my segue straight to Jan. Now, I sort of had two questions for you, Jan. I had one question to start with, but then I made the mistake of reading the comments underneath our article in the Australian online version, which is always a bit of a worry. But basically, there was a comment that went something like this: why would you bother asking the millennials? Because they don't know how good they've got it, because they've never had a recession. So I'll give you that little question. But then ask you more about how we can better engage young people into our economic reform agenda, and what you're trying to do with Foundation for Young Australians around the sorts of institutions that they want to build and the sorts of issues they're engaging in.
Yeah, I'll come back to the first question later if we have time, which we hopefully won't. I think there's a couple of things around the survey which I think were really, really interesting in terms of the kind of current generation. There's no doubt that employment is one of the #1 challenges. Our most recent report released last week highlights that although 60% of young people have got higher education qualifications, the highest number ever in any generation, 50% of them can't get full-time secure work. So we've got a massive disconnect between the investment, the time, the money, and the kind of commitment to learning and growing and getting qualified, and actually what the reality is. So I think that is writ large in your report, and then there's a whole lot of knock-on effects of that. Housing, access to housing, access to debt, more debt if you want it when you're already carrying a debt. That was interesting, wasn't it? We suddenly everything got quiet and we got a spotlight. Makes me feel slightly anxious. And then, of course, that story takes us inevitably back to education, and it's good to see education and skills jumped up there. You didn't talk about it specifically, but every single conversation that we have about employment, about transitions, about the fact that we've got double the number of young people in casual, precarious work than 10 years ago. I mean, all the numbers point to a very, very precarious, insecure labour market for this generation. So you can say all you like about avocados, laziness, millennials, and put them all in one sentence if you want to, Bernard. But actually the reality is obviously deeply more complex. And when we put the report out last week, and I spent a lot of time on Talkback Radio, mostly I heard from parents and young people saying, I am the parent of a young person who has 2 degrees or 1 degree or is trying to get into this sector, or I'm a young person who's done the things that I was told to do. In the last 26 years of unprecedented growth, I've aced the test, I've spent the time, the money, the effort, I've got my degree, I've got my double degree, I'm doing a master's, what more do you want me to do? And so we've got a massive disconnect in what we're teaching, what's learning, and then what's going on in the environment. So if that's not a kind of a number one issue for us, then economically, it needs to be, because it's costing us $15.9 billion a year in underutilisation of 18 to 25-year-olds. $15.9 billion in GDP. That's a significant, not insignificant number. So these are the challenges for us around education, employment, and the next generation.
Thanks, Jan. And a couple of points you made there get drawn out too if you have a look at, anyone wants to have a look through some of the more detailed data. And we will be putting the full survey results up online as well. But a couple of themes around people who are in more precarious work having slightly different attitudes to things, and also, not surprisingly, that younger cohort, whilst they still think these top 5 issues matter, you start seeing, of course, the importance of education and training that links back to real opportunities picking up in significance. I'm just going to direct one question to Tim, and then we will open to questions. Tim, really a lifetime spent in trying to understand community attitudes and trying to understand how we connect issues of reform and reform priorities to the community. What was your take out from the survey, and how do you think we can better connect the benefits of growth to the wider community?
Yeah, thanks. I was actually very worried. I think that it's fantastic you've done this survey. There should be more of these in-depth surveys. I ran a polling company for a couple of years, so I was probably guilty along with the rest of them. But polling has really just been introduced to these bizarre single-issue polls you see, and you can get people to answer whatever way you like on single-issue polls. It's great to see a really big, in-depth poll, and it's great if you do this over time. You'll get to see some really good results. I think the fact that only 5% of people believe they've gained a lot after the last 26 years was the real standout for me. That is a very worrying figure. We should all be worried about it. We should be worried about it in the context of what's happening in Australia's political culture. So open up the Fin today and here's the political parties, basically, the major parties basically on close to a third each on their primary, 18% of people who are with others. We're lucky our system in Australia doesn't encourage small, crazy parties like, say, the Italians. We don't have, we've got a much more stable House of Representatives in the way people are elected. It discourages crazies getting up. But that doesn't mean that the dam wall's not going to break at some point. So I'm really worried about that. In terms of all these narratives, I just don't... I think we're possibly at quite a low point in people actually having any sort of economic literacy. You just don't get people having these discussions. I think under Paul Keating's leadership, there was a lot of economic literacy. I think we're all partly to blame because of corporate speak and the way the English language has been basically blanded out. People don't know what it means when they hear things like productivity or sustainability, words like that. Throw into the mix what social media has done to us and how it's killing our inability to actually talk about these things. Where there's a contest of ideas, that worries me deeply. So we're all sort of drifting off into our little echo chambers. I can't even read the comments sections of blogs and media articles anymore. People have just got used to anonymously behaving like total wallies. So we've got a number of things converging on us. And what worries me is Australia, and this came through in the marriage equality campaign, which I was fortunate enough to lead the yes case for the postal vote. The Australian sense of a fair go and fairness is still really there. It's still one of the wonderful things about our country and our culture, even though it's a bit of a myth, you know, not everyone's equal. We've still got a long way to go. But the Australian cultural leaning towards fairness and equality and a fair go is still there. But this research is showing that the underpinnings of that are now probably going to be weakened. And if we move away from that in our culture, I really worry about where Australia's going. So sorry to be a total pessimist today, but I think this is a massive wake-up call.
Thanks, Tim. Well, I'm happy to open the floor to questions, and as in the previous session, if you've got a question, if you could raise your hand and then indicate who you are and where you're from, that would be very helpful. And we've got one question here straight away at the front.
Hello, I'm Lynn Ashpole from Austrade. I was really interested, Melinda, hearing your commentary around your survey and listening to this discussion, and it seemed to me that the really strong theme coming out of all of this was inequality. I think I read over the weekend that Australia's becoming a lot more unequal. It might be perhaps in the top 5 in OECD countries, which really alarmed me. And I'm interested in the panel's thoughts about inequality as an overriding theme here and what might be able to be done about that. Just to ask you a really big question.
I'll start, we can move along. I'll talk about it in terms of education because there is no doubt that globally every single piece of research anywhere says that education's a level playing field. So this is a very, 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 very important starting point. We still have not, despite, 2 Gonskis, one Gonski's enough, really, isn't it? One David Gonski, but 2 Gonskis are even better. And we still have not actually gone to the core of what the inequity issues are and how we're going to sort those yet. We also, though, do know some things which in our report I found really fascinating. Basically, our report said that if you gave young people who had less advantaged backgrounds, so came from low SES backgrounds, a kind of skill set that was much more about the kind of transferable, portable, global skill set. We call it kind of enterprising skills, those things that used to be called soft skills that are now hard skills, like collaboration and teamwork and problem solving and creativity. If you ensured that young people and children from low SES backgrounds got those skills, it would bring them very quickly to the same level as children and young people in more advantaged contexts. And that was very, very, very important because we've had a technical content-led only education system till now. So there are some things that we can do in some areas, particularly in education, that actually do change radically and quickly outcomes for young people. So again, let's start at the core. The base core is education, health. We know what these things are that create equity, and I think we start there and we are very explicit and intentional and purposeful about what we do in the next 5 and 10 years.
So I haven't looked at the OECD data on this lately, so I'm not going to talk about the specifics clearly. One of the things we do know is that increasing inequality does not lead to a happy and prosperous society. It's a straight out fact. I think the thing that Tim pointed to, though, which is really important, that looking at these data, regardless of the facts on what's been happening with the Gini coefficient, people feel that there's increasing inequality. And that in of itself is a major issue, I think. So again, to his point, I mean, I remember the days in the 80s when we had the forced lesson on, Paul Keating's version of economics and where we sat in the world and how we had to work together. And, we went through all of that. We haven't seen that for years. And there's a whole generation, in fact, I sat with the youngest person in my family, who's not quite 25, at dinner last night, talking about and thinking, why didn't you learn this at university, as we went through some of this history? So I think there is both a real issue here, and remembering that we've been pretty good at redistributing incomes to lower income people in this community. That's actually one of the things we've been quite effective at. But people don't feel that. They feel they're struggling, and they are not necessarily sufficiently economically literate to understand the language that we use in the public discourse, all of which I think, again, to Tim's point, stacks up to be a problem. So the question of what we do to address genuine inequality and opportunity is very real, both in health and education and a series of other things. What we do to talk about these issues so we can have a more informed and robust dialogue, not in your own echo chamber, and preferably without all those dreadful trolls on the Australian's website. And I don't read them either because they're just awful. But also a conversation about what we want to be as a country. If you go and talk to people in Scandinavia, for example, Sweden comes immediately to mind. They have a really clear understanding in the labour market about keeping the country prosperous from an export perspective and making sure that they make a contribution to increasing technology and upskilling in their businesses in order to basically benefit everybody. I don't think we could have that conversation here. So I think the whole question of inequality is incredibly important, but the solution is complex.
You stole most of my points, Jane. No, that was good. Just to add to that, there's two things that I worry about. One of the things is that I think our cities are becoming very divided, and most of the people in this room, myself included, we don't really understand what inequality looks like these days because we're not in it. And I think one of the things that comes across a lot when people like us talk about this is that a sense of, well, you've never actually had it so good. We've got all these technological advances and, poverty doesn't look in some ways the way it used to. But, and I think that's something we've got to be really, really careful of, because it's very clear from this poll that we can debate the ins and outs of, is there more inequality or not in the last 5-10 years? But the perception is very, very strong from people that there is and that it's not acceptable. So if we just continue to say either you never had it that good, or we get into one of these tedious culture war type debates about the definition of inequality, we are missing this enormous finding in this survey. 79% of people believing that the gap is not acceptable.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and that result was really robust no matter what your income. So even if you thought you were doing really well and you'd gained a lot, people were still observing around this issue around inequality. And CEDA did some work on this earlier this year, which you can get at our website. And really, the things that we tried to highlight was the points that Jan made around the equality of opportunity is really fundamental to people. And the issues that we called out there were around education and making sure that the future opportunities you had weren't defined by the opportunities that your parents had, and that your future opportunities weren't defined based on where you lived. And in fact, what we referred to as postcode inequality is very real, with a small proportion of postcodes really accounting for very high levels of disadvantage and inequality. And then, of course, finally, people are very concerned about the poorest amongst us, hence the focus on increasing New Start, for instance. Now, I think there was another question at the back here. Oh, sorry. Oh, Damien, you going to talk about productivity again?
No, I'll leave that, but...
yeah, I'd welcome it.
I was going to... I did hear a comment made from the head of AI for Google last year, which I thought was a fascinating comment, which was just that his perspective was that AI would increase the inequality gap because the poor amongst society don't have the opportunity to access the benefits of technology the way that the wealthy do. And I think Tim made that comment just before around all the new technologies we've got. I mean, Does the panel think that that is a realistic point of view, or do we disagree with that?
I'm happy to jump straight in on that. I mean, it was an issue again that we explored in the paper that we did earlier on inequality, and you know, I think the challenge with new technologies, artificial intelligence, algorithmic decision making, is it depends on the quality of the data that goes in and the algorithms themselves, around which there's very little scrutiny. And we've already seen plenty of examples, particularly from overseas, of where the results of those technologies and that decision making can actually entrench disadvantage through underlying bias. It's very, very important, and ensure that we get a handle on this and we start thinking about what the right approach is to ensure that we're comfortable with the outcomes that come from that, and we don't unintentionally entrench disadvantage. And the point about access to technologies and those skills is absolutely fundamental. So they're points that we've called out pretty strongly, and I think we're going to have to get a handle on that, but also some of the other implications of technology, including the gig economy type work and what that means for people's future prosperity and their ability to save for retirement and all those kinds of things.
One of the related points is whether it will increase the wealth gap is how it's taxed, and whether we continue to see an elite who own some of that technology, and if they behave in a way that avoids tax, then we will see increased inequality, the technical side of the side. And for anyone who's following it, that's what's driving a lot of the debate about the universal basic income. I'm not convinced by it myself. I'm open to it, though. I'm open to the discussion about it. But that is what's driving a lot of the concern, that we will end up with a lot of people who are basically technically employed but really unemployed, without access to the wealth that those technologies are creating, without tax so that can be redistributed. So that's another really good example. That's a really fascinating debate. I love discussions about the universal basic income. People go off their dial, but when you've actually got a respectful forum where you can actually have a really good debate about it, it's fascinating. And I'll go back to my earlier point. I'm really worried that we're just lacking those forums. And Twitter ain't the place for it to be happening, right? But we've got to get back to good old-fashioned respectful debate, with a bit of evidence and some good old-fashioned respect, because we have some huge challenges coming, and we're only going to be able to deal with them if we get back to that ability to rationally work our way through it.
So many things to talk about, but just two quickly. One, I think the regulatory environment is writ large as a massive issue, but I do think two things. We should never underestimate actually what the power of this thing is in the hands of all people, and particularly where we've seen in other countries around the world that frog leapt kind of straight to your own personal device, where we're going to we own our own data, which, health, I think education's going to go there. There is huge and massive opportunity for AI, but there are also, like everything, incredible risks. So for me, it's about Tim's point, where do we have public, open debate, discourse? I noticed last weekend on a Sunday afternoon, raining like anything in Melbourne, maybe this is why, but a room full of this number of people kind of jumped into a room to talk about blockchain and privacy and for good or evil, and it was packed on, at 3 o'clock on a Sunday. So people actually do genuinely want to have these conversations, but I think they do need to get off Twitter and they need to get into rooms where people can genuinely engage.
The head of AI for Google clearly has a great deal of technological capability. Whether they have a great deal of understanding of how the rest of the world works, fair question. But if you think about it, there's just about everything that happens in this world that has the capacity to increase inequality. So it's not exactly the kind of observation that I would stop in the street and go, wow, what an insight. But what I would say is, just like everything else that has that potential, we should ask ourselves the questions: are they accountable? Are they transparent? What values underpin how that technology is being created and being used? And I do think we have to, for people who have a core interest in how government operates, because at the end of the day, yes, we'd all like to think that people will self-regulate, but we have myriad of examples where that hasn't always been the case. And government isn't very quick. And this world is speeding up. So the challenge for government is, how do you keep pace? And heaven knows, do you ever get in front? Now, the US, I was in the US last week actually having some conversations which are a little bit similar. They have only just gotten round to actually figuring out they need to tax internet-based sales. How long have we all been ordering whatever on the internet? A very, very long time. I did think to myself, it should mean that they'll stop geo-blocking assorted sites from Australia fairly shortly, because they'll have had to install the technology. But my point is this: if we wait the same amount of time it's taken the US, and indeed us, to deal with the under $1,000 issue, in respect of AI, we will be picking up the pieces. Because at the end of the day, much as I like to think that people will be benign in the way they operate these technologies, but actually, to your point, the algorithms themselves have values implicit, and they've been caught out assuming that if you're black and from certain communities, you have no interest in particular things. So accountability, transparency, being clear what the values are, and government's got to speed up.
Question here. Thank you.
You should be fine.
Okay. Hi, Katie Taylor. I'm from Navitas. We work across higher education and vocational education. And this morning on the radio, there was an article saying that one of the large aged care providers in New South Wales and Queensland were outsourcing their kitchen and laundry staff. And one of the people who were affected by that change were actually interviewed on the ABC, and she was a kitchen staff person, and she was saying that she was really upset because she would have liked to stayed with the company. She'd been with it 13 years. But the only sort of, if you like, redeployment opportunity that she was offered was to go and be a nurse. And she was, saying, I don't have the skills. I don't have the skills for that. And I suppose I was just wondering if the panel would reflect on the fact that, these changes are happening in our economy really fast. So she was offered a redundancy, so what's that, maybe 3 months pay. She's not going to be able to get any training or reskilling in that time that will make her competitive to even contribute to that company going forward. So any reflections on how we can do this better?
One of the great tragedies of the last 10 years, to be really frank, is the kind of TAFE system, because the place where you have the most capacity to upskill and retrain is actually in that system. It's cost effective, it's accessible, you can break it up and put it in different pieces, you can bring it in and out of your life in a very, very different way to, say, university-based education. Although universities, to their credit, are moving fast to micro-credentialise and offer a whole range of new options. But this speaks very much to the changing nature of work. I don't think that we speak anything like honestly enough in this country about the fact that, for instance, in the 80s, 400,000 men lost their jobs in manufacturing, never to work again. We just don't talk about it. It's like the kind of dirty secret, and just let's try not to think about it. But actually, the rate of change and the rate of displacement and the promise... The promise is that you'll get a new job. There'll be all these new industries and all these new jobs, and that may well be the case, but without actually conscious and explicit thinking about retraining, upskilling, redeployment, knowing where there are clusters of work, where will the next 3 lots of tens and tens and tens of jobs be. We all know that we've got hundreds more jobs than there were 10 years ago in new fields. That's great. But if we could get a little predictive, if we could start to think about where are the opportunities in what fields, again, there's research around that. This is information that we do know in Australia. We know we're in an ageing population where caring is going to be much more highly sought after. We know that technology is going to continue to grow. We know that information and knowledge information is going to continue to grow. So there's 3 clusters of jobs straight up that have got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of jobs in them, but we're not helping people. And our risk, and it's such a risk, is that we say you're on your own, work it out. It's the very, very individual kind of, it's your journey. You know, sometimes it's painted as such a wonderful, it's your journey, create your own adventure, whereas actually it's not. It's a hellish outcome of rapid transformation and disruption, and employers and governments and communities have a responsibility to get around people and help this transition. Again, it is clearly a productivity issue. I mean, clearly and explicitly, as well as a prosperity, as well as an equity issue. So, but, you know, my point is always there are things we can do. These are not new ideas. It's about implementation, and it's about having a very clear strategy and vision around implementation, what we know we need to do.
So I think exactly the same way, and I won't repeat that. But the bottom line is this isn't new. We've been going through this forever. I mean, how many people remember when the Commonwealth Bank had all those tellers and they were owned by the government? Australia Post. I mean, we could go on and on and on with the kind of structural adjustment that's occurred in all sorts of industries. This isn't new. And the truth of the matter is, particularly for aged care providers, it's interesting. There's a big aged care provider in Canberra who's just bought all of their catering back in-house. So, I mean, this waxes and wanes. The challenge is the transition and how you manage the transition and how you give somebody an opportunity to aspire to something new and the skills to actually go after something new. And one additional point, if I might make it, there is no conversation at the moment about the casualisation of the workforce and the issues about insecure employment. So the issue about people up to the age of 25, so the aforementioned 24-year-old I was having dinner with last night is still in insecure employment. I mean, hasn't been out of work, but hasn't got, inverted commas, a permanent job. Now, what exactly a permanent job means in the new world, I think is a conversation we could have. But for people who start work with an expectation and then that gets ripped from them, I think that's a very hard adjustment. So it's not new and we're not very good at managing it, and we need to have more of a conversation about it.
Oh, look, finally, I get depressed with the productivity debate in Australia because there is so much focus on wages, workplace flexibility, that side of the equation. I don't think there's enough on workforce skills, what technology, the best application of technology, and also really good management and making sure we've got really great managers at the enterprise and the workplace level. We go down the lazy debate and end up in a huge class warfare over the industrial relations workplace side of it. The whole other part of the productivity equation, I think, in this country, it's really wanting.
Thanks for that. Now, before I go to the next question, and thank you so much for your patience, I have been repeatedly reminded by the team in the box that of the numbers of votes, we've had 200 people vote, 201 actually, which probably everyone in the room, so don't vote twice. But I just thought I'd let you know. Now, question in the back, thank you.
Rachel Baxendale from The Australian. Which was very interesting. And I also heard you, Melinda, on Radio National this morning saying that you nevertheless think that government and business should persist with the case for company tax cuts. I'm interested in why you think that and the views of the other panellists.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question, I have to say, when you get presented it on the back of these survey results. And I mean, I wasn't surprised. I've been following these issues for a long time now, and for those of you who haven't been involved in this debate, I mean, the company tax debate and the tax reform debate has just been going on for so long in this country, and I think where we are at the moment in terms of some of the things we've seen recently in terms of business behaviour and a lot of focus on the banks, people feel that big business has done well. That's clearly come the result out of our survey. They don't feel connected to economic growth, therefore they don't feel connected to the success of business. And so they don't see it as important in their daily lives. And I get that, but I think the challenge is we do need a competitive business sector. Whether we're talking about delivering better outcomes through human services, which if you look through the Productivity Commission report, we are going to have to innovate like no tomorrow to get to meet the expectations, to deal with population ageing, to manage all of this with new technology more effectively, and quite frankly for better outcomes, not just more dollars spent. So we need business to be involved in a whole range of things, and we need them to be able to compete, to attract investment and ideas and all the rest of it. In the time that we've been talking about tax cuts in this country, corporate tax cuts, the rest of the world has moved on. In the 2 years that we've been talking about it, the US has really smashed their tax rate. Other countries are doing the same. We just have to make sure that our businesses are well placed to compete. At the same time, I think in my questioning to Jane, I think we need to be clear that there are expectations that business is going to be expected to meet. And they are going to have to help themselves if they want a better tax environment and a better regulatory environment in terms of how they respond to that. And I was jotting down notes as Jane was talking about Google, because quite frankly they're the same messages I think that need to flow to the rest of business, which is about accountability and transparency. And so I think what goes hand in glove with corporate tax cuts is an expectation that more companies will sign up to the Tax Transparency Code, and that more companies are going to start being a heck of a lot more transparent around their engagement with their employees, being proactive rather than reactive, ensuring that they're doing the right thing by their employees and also by their customers, doing the right thing by their customers. So I don't think anyone benefits by undermining the competitiveness of business today because we think that this is somehow a reward, but I do think that quid pro quo is going to be meeting the increased expectations. Sorry, slightly long-winded.
I can tell you two things about the next generation, which I think is powerfully profound in this context. And we speak to about 150,000 of them on our platforms, which is more than any number of members of a political party, but way less than the AFL. So somewhere in between there. AFL membership still kills it in Australia. The new church wins. And they are very, very, very clear about actually something at the kind of next meta level, which is institutions, the distrust in institutions broadly and generally is very, very, very strong. It's why there were 300,000 young people not registered to vote in this country, but when they got the opportunity to vote on a marriage equality survey, something that they felt very, very, very strongly and personally about and was about equality, they came out in droves and 60,000 of them signed up. So it tells you so much about where they are at around distrust in institutions, wanting to see institutions rethought, redesigned, re-engineered to suit them and to suit a new world, which is actually one that's much more hyper-connected, much more concerned about sustainability of the planet, much more concerned about, I always talk about the I, we, us. So yes, they're concerned about their own job security and future. They're very concerned about inequality and equality, we, and they're very concerned about the planet, us. And that, by the way, I think is absolutely phenomenal and brilliant that is kind of their sort, I, we, us, in that kind of order with those kind of big kind of picture items and thinking. And in that sits, how do we work with and engage with institutions? How do they get transformed and how do they become much more fit for purpose in the world that they want to be part of?
One of the things I think we need to be careful about with surveys like this is that we don't treat them as being the recipe for how we should always go forward. They point sometimes to areas we need to work harder to talk to people about what actually it will be that will give them a better quality of life. And we've got some really clear messages here about where we have failed in that communication exercise and where people do not feel, and for all sorts of very good reasons, can I say, to really think that the right thing is being done by them. I've just spent a week talking to people in the United States, in the business community, about the flow and the flight of jobs and opportunity in that country and how concerned they are about it and how the issue of how business can actually work with government and with communities to provide opportunity. So at the end of the day, we've got the same challenge here. So I think from a business tax cut perspective, I think we do need to be competitive in the world, otherwise the jobs won't just flow from the outer urban areas into the centre of towns, they will flow out of our country, and we need to understand that. At the same time, there's a compact here that is needed, which is about corporate responsibility, corporate accountability, corporate transparency. And the truth of the matter is that one set of really bad behaviours ruins trust. And we're going to see that today in the Royal Commission on Banking. And I think there's a great understanding, particularly in places that I currently work, about the need to improve our behaviour. It doesn't mean that we're always going to agree with people, but actually being fair and being seen to be fair and being accountable is really part of that. So this cuts both ways. We don't want jobs to flow offshore. We want a prosperous economy where our young people, my young people, your young people, all of our young people and our older people who've been structurally adjusted out of work have opportunity. It takes two to tango though. So everyone's got a part to play in this, but I do support those cuts.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting time for people to be pushing corporate tax cuts. When you look at this survey, 5% of people thinking they've personally gained a lot and 74% thinking that large corporations have gained a lot. I'm concerned about us constantly running this narrative, whether it's personal income tax cuts or business tax cuts, that Australians are overtaxed. We're not. And if we want to do the 5 things that come next, reliable low-cost basic health services, reliable essential services, housing, all the rest, that people in Australia are after, we have to have some revenue. So I think there's been some quite misleading stuff around about how we're overtaxed. Happens across all sorts of tax debates, not just the business tax debates. I know that some of the comparisons are slightly dodgy given when you add up some of the taxes overseas, not just the corporate tax rates, but all the other taxes that businesses pay. Some of these claims can come into question. So I don't think it's actually a good time to be doing tax cuts of any sort. That's my personal view. I don't think we can afford it at the moment. But I really worry about the we're all overtaxed narrative when you look at what's coming down the pipeline demographically and what people are actually expecting. This very sensible list. Interesting that in this era of insecurity, people are going back to institutions and things in Australia that they trust, and one of them is a reliable healthcare system, because people know that you may get certain pay incentives and all the rest, but if you don't have a good health system, you're in strife. So far be it for me to tell the business community how to run its campaign, but the timing is challenging for them, and I don't think that it's wise for them to go down the path that some industry groups overseas have done, where you basically try and astroturf your way out of trouble. Astroturfing is fake grassroots movements, right? So trying to create groundswells for corporate tax cuts and things like that. I think it's much better for the business community just have the debate, all the facts on the table, try and persuade people on the merits of the argument. That's my view about the current debate.
Well, I've got to wrap things up here. Thank you so much to each of you for your contributions and supporting CEDA and its efforts. I'm sure we'll be engaging you plenty in the future. Thanks, everyone. That's the end of this session.